and so I'm worried about.
Well, I get that part, but what I'm worried about is when you ask Sanjay Gupta, should you be taking it? He will invariably waffle. He'll invariably say, well, there's a clinical trial underway, and blah, whereas as a scientist, I can say, no, in the absence of evidence, the answer is no, don't take it.
Right.
What as a philosopher, what's the correct response here?
I think he's playing the numbers game. I think he's of the mind to think, what's the likelihood of the people who are taking it that have pre-existing heart conditions that this will affect adversely versus those who do not. So maybe in his mind, he's doing a numbers game saying, let's say 1 million people take Trump's advice, and they model his behavior and they take it. And maybe it is a prophylactic treatment, and it does stave off this for 100,000 of those people, but it only kills 4 of them. Maybe he's a utilitarian. Maybe it's like the greatest good for the greatest number. So, yep, I gave advice and it ended up killing 4 people, but look, it might have saved 100,000 because we don't know right now because of these ongoing tests. So in the absence of evidence, he's just trying to come up with some kind of way in which to give a number, a utility, a value. And I think that might be what's going on in his head, is he's just thinking, well, just based on the sheer numbers, yeah, given those who have had it in the past, yeah, sure, why not? Right? And I think that's why they're waffling, because how many trials are going on right now? There's hundreds of them. And you can go online. Anybody can find out.
Yes.
There's a lot of them going on.
But there are hundreds of trials going on for hundreds of potential drugs.
I know.
Including possibly vitamin C and penicillin, I don't know.
That's
but
right.
In the absence of any results from those trials and any evidence that they might be effective, surely if you're asked your advice, the answer is no, don't take them.
That's right. And so is he being counter to the Hippocratic Oath? Right. So
that's what I'm wondering. Do physicians are they just more cautious than the rest of us, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the biggest problems is the world really doesn't understand the drug developing process. Like, they just have no idea what goes on. They have no idea of the cost. They have no idea of the time constraints that are involved. I think as an offshoot to the question you're asking, Larry, is to come back round to the idea of, there's a website, I believe, called One Day Less. And it's a gentleman who's looking for people who are willing to be subjects for vaccine experiments. So that if it hurries up the vaccine even 1 day less, right, and it'll cure that many more thousands. So there's over 16,000 people who have signed up.
Yeah, that's a different question.
It is a different question, but in this case, you see, with hydroxychloroquine, absence of evidence, not even that. There was that large study with veterans that showed no efficacy. So we do have some evidence that it really hasn't worked under
the prophylactic one. I was talking about. Yeah, we pretty much settled the idea that it's not going to cure. But we could have known that already. There's no cure for coronavirus, for common cold. People have been looking for medications for years and years and years. I think, it's rather silly to think that someone's all of a sudden going to come up with a medicine that cures COVID-19. It's just not going to happen. We'll have to wait for the vaccine.
Right. With the antivirals, I think the best that they can hope for, like with remdesivir, is that it lessens its effect. Right? We're going to see more and more of that.
It's possible, but you also, as you're well aware of the fact, that when you're testing hundreds of different drugs, and each are doing 20 trials, then one of those trials is going to be statistically significant, right?
Yes.
And that's the one that's going to get reported in the news.
That's right.
And it doesn't say anything. It doesn't tell you whether it works or not.
That's right. Well, we're just going to have to. It's time, and people aren't very patient. right now. The last thing they want to do is wait around.
But I think we should have more people, we have more authorities out there saying, don't get your hopes up about medication. You know, this is not a big mystery. We've been looking for antivirals for decades and decades and decades. And it's not going to happen just all of a sudden because of this pandemic. They simply don't exist at any efficacy. So forget about that.
Now, Larry, what do you think about, for the first time in history, we have this many labs and much cooperation working on a single pathogen. Could that potentially give more hope that an antiviral will lessen the effects even greater than remdesivir, or that a vaccine might be produced more rapidly because the whole world is now focused on this?
I don't hold up much hope for antivirals, but certainly in the case of vaccines, it's wonderful that you've got 100 projects underway all around the world that are being funded adequately. You know, one of them is bound to hit. The only antiviral I know about is that there's a study at UT, and there's some others where you just make massive amounts of artificial antibodies against the virus.
Right.
Okay? That certainly could be effective at blocking the virus, but I don't know how you deliver them.
Yeah,
I don't know how you get those antibodies into people's throats on a daily basis, you know, so.
Now, wasn't that technique used in the Spanish flu? Didn't they use antibodies in some treatments?
I don't know if they might have used them, not as a I don't know.
We have a historian of there. Maybe you can enlighten us. Let us know. Well, it's nice seeing you again, Larry.
Thanks. Nice seeing you too.
We'll have to get together for coffee.
We will.
At a distance, of course.
Okay. Thanks, Larry and Chris. And I had a request from Dr. Mike Allen, who also wants to chime in with some medical professional information as with respect to what the two of them were discussing. So go ahead, Mike.
Thanks, Shauna. Chris, I'm a family doctor by training, although I'm not in clinical practice anymore, and I've got a bit of familiarity with epidemiology and evidence-based medicine, so I thought I would just mention a couple of things. As far as evidence goes for medical treatments, we have what's called a pyramid or hierarchy of evidence. And the ones that we're talking about now with drugs are clinical trials where you have groups randomized to take either the drug or not take the drug, and neither the patient or the researcher knows which group they're assigned to. But there are other less rigorous forms of evidence, like observational studies or cohort studies and case control studies. And there may be some evidence from those lower levels of evidence for some of these treatments, such as vitamin D or sunshine. Those would be observational studies. So we don't discount that evidence completely, but we put a lot more confidence in it. But nevertheless, when it comes to a drug, we do have to go through that process, as you mentioned, the 3-phase process, where we have, at the end of it, a good, strong, well-designed, randomized, controlled trial. And that's what we're moving to. As far as something like hydroxychloroquine goes, you have to also consider the potential harms, and I think the study that we're talking about showed there was no benefit, but there are some potential harms, particularly for people with existing cardiac conditions. So for something like that, you can't really say, well, it's worth taking it, because what have you got to lose? Because there might be some adverse effects. For something like vitamin D or vitamin C, it's unlikely there's going to be any adverse effects from those unless you take massive doses of vitamin D. So it's one of those things where somebody might say, well, it probably won't help. It might help, but it probably won't harm you. So go ahead. You want to take vitamin C. It might help, but it probably won't harm you. So you're okay. Hydroxychloroquine, we're pretty sure it's not going to help, but there's some evidence that it might harm you, so don't take that. So that was what I wanted to contribute to Larry's question.
Thanks, Mike. We have a few more people want to ask questions. I'm going to ask you to be as brief as possible. So Sid is next. Go ahead, Sid.
Thanks, Dr. DiCarlo, for a great presentation. Apply the skills and tools that you've taught on this workshop. So, for example, I have a mini small case study of an anti-lockdown group, libertarian, that mentioned two premise for their argument of why the isolation lockdown is unnecessary. The virus is highly contagious, which they agreed on that premise, but they kind of were questioning the death rate or the seriousness of the virus by giving different stats, like saying the number of deaths should be divided by the death plus the cases recovered instead of just the cases reported, or the virus has been here since October, November, so the number of cases reported that went recovered or under reported. So just trying to understand, like, how can we apply these critical skills and tools you've taught today in everyday life when we hear arguments, going forward?
Right. So always, question where people have gotten their information. Like, what are the sources, right? And were they reliably obtained? Are they coming from a fairly neutral source? And are they cross-referenced? Are they coming from a variety of different sources that say essentially the same thing? And that way we can better separate political ideology and politically ideologically driven belief systems from the so-called facts. And I know, the Trump administration tried to bring in alternative facts, that there are facts and there are alternative. No, that doesn't exist. A fact is a fact, and it basically means information that has been garnered in a responsible way about some aspect of the natural world or social environments. And if you can make sure the information has been reliably obtained, then people should follow where the evidence leads. I mean, that's what it's about, right? Are we being responsible